Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. Thank you for hanging with us for the past 15 minutes. We unfortunately were having some technical issues. We're still working on getting our other panelist, Victor Pickard, to join, but we have two of our amazing panelists here today, Abigail Higgins and Pennsylvania State Representative Chris Rabb. And we're going to get started today to talk about funding the future of local news, state and local solutions in a time of crisis. My name is Mike Rispoli. I'm the Senior Director of Journalism and Civic Information at Free Press Action. Free Press Action is a nonpartisan organization that fights for the public's right to connect and communicate. We do not support or oppose any candidate for public office. What we are here to do is to advocate for a media system that serves the public interest. And we're going to be talking a little bit about state and local solutions to the lack of news and information that a lot of our communities have. And so running a little bit behind today, but I do wanted to get us started, set the table a little bit, share a little bit about kind of like the environment that we're in and why we're kind of here to chat today. Um, Simply put, I think there are a lot of attacks to independent journalism that are happening right now. We've seen the devastating collapse of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, escalating attacks on press freedom, the ongoing hollowing out of local news. All of these things represent a real existential threat to our communities because we know that when the public doesn't have access to news and information, they can't find out about what's happening where they live, what's happening in their schools, what's happening in the halls of government. Um, and even though we are kind of facing this challenging moment when it comes to independent journalism, if there was ever a moment to build a new public infrastructure for local news and civic information, it is now. And why does this matter for communities? Like I mentioned, those cuts to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, those have been devastating to public broadcasters across the country. It means um, more shuttered TV and radio stations. It means fewer emergency alerts, fewer hours of children's programming, fewer watchdogs keeping communities informed, particularly in rural communities. Um, and while these are kind of new cuts that are happening right now to public broadcasters, we know that over the past 2 decades, there's been a serious loss of local commercial newspapers in communities. Hedge fund consolidation, corporate takeover of our media system has led to newsroom closures, journalism layoffs, and really an alien information landscape, which is increasingly leaving people in the dark. It's also going to have an effect on funding. With the cuts to public media funding, a lot of TV and radio stations are going to be competing for the same limited pool of resources that other non-commercial outlets have had to fight over for years. And so, right now, in this crisis, we also have an opportunity. This federal dysfunction and disinvestment forces us to look elsewhere for solutions. State and local municipalities are stepping up to fill that gap, creating civic information infrastructure that's designed to meet the needs of communities today. There's growing momentum for this reimagined, publicly supported local news media system. Um, Take, for instance, the New Jersey Civic Information Consortium. The idea of a independent public grant making body to support community information needs and to support local news. Just a few years ago, people didn't believe that that was possible. But now, if you look at the New Jersey Civic Information Consortium, $10 million in public funds invested over 5 years. You're seeing lawmakers in Wisconsin, Oregon, and soon to be Pennsylvania to advance bills that would utilize public grant making to support local news. And we've even got a lawmaker in Michigan who's interested in creating a public fund for public broadcasters. And we know that we need to act now to help support these new ideas because we can't wait for the federal government to get its act together. And we know that the commercial local news, it's not necessarily a market that's going to be able to correct this real problem. So bold state level action is needed today to protect communities and set a model for a national movement. The groundwork we laid today at the state and local level will determine whether we emerge from this crisis with a weaker media system or with a stronger, more equitable, more community-rooted one. And the fight for a free and vibrant, independent local media system is inseparable from the fight for democracy. And so, this conversation is really about power. How do we build it at the local level? How do we come up with community-rooted solutions? And how do we bring people together to help work together to help create a new public media system? And so, with all of that, I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. First, Pennsylvania State Representative Chris Rabb. Welcome, Representative. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here.
And we've also got Abigail Higgins from the 51st and the National Writers Union. Abigail, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. And like I mentioned, we're working still to get Victor Pickard here today, but we're going to get going with this amazing panel of people. First, Representative Rabb, I want to give you an opportunity to go ahead and introduce yourself and maybe share a little bit about why media policy and local news is an issue that's important to you.
I'm so thrilled to be a part of this panel and this event. I'm totally nerding out. I never have enough time or opportunity to talk about the importance of how I talk about media justice and media democracy. I don't know if I'd even be in office if it weren't for my direct and personal connection with independent and community media. My great-great-grandfather founded the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper nearly 135 years ago, and it's still owned by my family. Now, there's no wealth in it, but it has an extraordinary legacy of raising up and amplifying the voices of marginalized communities, specifically the African-American community, initially in Baltimore over a century ago, and then nationally and internationally covering important news that the mainstream media would not cover, including extraordinary luminaries that we all embrace and are inspired by today, whether it's Jackie Robinson or Marian Anderson, or W.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, MLK. We were covering things that the mainstream media refused to. So independent media is in my cultural DNA. And I learned as a entry-level legislative staffer in the 90s in the US Senate, how whatever your most important issue is, whether it's climate change or gender justice or whatever, your second one has to be media justice, because the folks in the media industry in that field control the narratives for everything that affects us and everything we care about. And to make sure that it is a democratic space that represents the voices and priorities of everyone, not just the moneyed interests, is precisely why we're in this jackpot right now. To think that I think often of the corporate duopoly of how Democrats and Republicans, and I know this is a nonpartisan space, so I'm not putting one party over the other. I'm actually indicting the system and using this as an analogy for media, is that I operate, unfortunately, in a corporate duopoly where some corporations support Democrats and other corporations support Republicans. And I hear people who want to do better and say, oh, I don't listen to Fox News, I listen to MSNBC, I watch MSNBC. And I'm like, okay, great, but they're all owned by mega corporations who don't have our best interests at heart. We need to look beyond this corporate duopoly to a broader realm that's community-based, that's truly independent, that's rigorous, that's investigative, that's representative of our broad ideological spectrum, and particularly the communities of struggle and the folks closest to the pain, to make sure that we're lifting up their voices and their talents in meaningful ways. And so that's why I'm here. I'm so happy to also be introducing legislation around these issues that you brought up, Mike. But this is so important to everything we care about. For those of you who are journalists in the media sphere or beyond, it is interwoven into every fight we have on any issue we truly care about.
Yeah, thank you so much, Representative. I really appreciate you sharing that personal story and why this is an issue that you care about deep in your heart. Just wanted to welcome Victor to the panel. Thanks so much. Victor, sorry about some of the technical issues, but we're glad that you were able to join us today. I'll let you breathe for a second since you've been fighting to get onto Zoom for the past 24 minutes. And so we're just going around sharing a little bit about ourselves and kind of just personally like why this is an issue that you care about. So I'll pass it to you, Abigail. Love to have you share a little bit more about yourself and kind of what's calling you to be here today and to be doing journalism where you live.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So my background is originally in international journalism. I spent a decade as a foreign correspondent in Kenya and reported all around East and Central Africa, which was work that I absolutely loved. And I continue to be very passionate about international journalism. But I also always struggled with the gap that it felt like there was between the publications that I worked for and the audiences that I was reporting on. Um, and as media continued to be hollowed out, it felt like that gap got wider. Um, I came back to the US about 6 years ago, and I made a pivot into local news. And as soon as I started working in local news, I was incredibly struck by the difference in the reception to my stories. Sometimes when I was working on huge stories about a coup or a terrorist attack for major publications, it still kind of felt like I was just dropping stories off into the ether. I wasn't totally sure if anyone was reading them. One of the first local news stories I wrote about school boundaries and how they impacted race in DC. I was blown away by the response I got to them, by how many comments there were on the stories, by how many emails I got, by how many people had opinions about them, by the ways people wanted to try and use it for local legislation or like local policy arguments. And I just was really, really taken by the immediate impact that local news can have on people's lives, and the ability that local news has to build community. So I started working for DCist, which was a beloved local news outlet, which was shut down by the public radio station WAMU about a year ago, laying off 16 journalists. Um, a handful of us who used to work for the publication got together and said, what would it look like to start a worker-run news outlet in Washington, D.C.? And we then very quickly launched the 51st, which is DC's newest worker-run news outlet. And I think it has been a really welcome addendum to the work that I have been doing at the National Writers Union, where I've been an organizer for several years. I think the longer I've spent in this industry, the more that I've really believed that as journalists, our job today can no longer just be telling good stories or getting investigative scoops or fighting for awards. We need to continue to do all of those things. But as media workers, it is also our responsibility to be a part of the fight to ensure that we continue to have a journalism industry at all.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Abigail. I appreciate that. I especially appreciate what you were saying at the end about the importance of getting organized to create change. And we're probably going to talk a little bit about that on this panel later on. Victor, I wanted to pass it over to you. Love for you to share a little bit about yourself and kind of, yeah, like what's kind of top of mind for you today? What's bringing you to this work?
Sure. I'm just glad to be here and to join you all. I apologize for getting in a bit late. But I first came to these issues both as an academic and an activist, first with the indie media movement in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was very clear to me from early on that our major media were failing us in many ways, in quite spectacular ways, especially the run up to the Iraq War in the early 2000s. And so I was really looking at how do we create alternative models from the mainstream commercial media, and began studying this as an academic. And to this day, I continue to focus on alternative models for media. And based on, I guess I drank the Kool-Aid early on, getting involved with the media reform movement in the early 2000s. I came to believe that whatever your first issue is, media has got to be your second issue, because you're not going to get very far on your primary issue if you have a hostile or even non-existent media system. So this core insight that we all learn in school, that democracy requires a free and by implication a functional press system, is something I've really taken to heart, and I continue to study that both historically and internationally, and trying to figure out how we can create a truly democratic media system here in the States. So that's always on the top of my mind.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Victor. I might come back to you actually for this first question. So one of the things we talked about when we opened up today were those really devastating cuts and the elimination of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. You're one of the more preeminent scholars when it comes to public media. I would love for you to share a little bit about, what do we stand to lose democratically and civically when we fail to fund public media, especially in this environment dominated by corporate giants, as the representative was laying out. So what do we stand to lose when public media is not something when media is not something that's publicly supported in a democratic country?
Sure. So, as I'm sure that many of our viewers and listeners in the audience today already know, but even before this latest rescissions package, this latest blow to public media, we are already almost literally off the chart for how little we allocated to our public media at the federal level. It came out to less than $1.60 per person per year. You compare that to many of the peer democracies, I wouldn't even call them peer democracies anymore, just healthy democracies around the planet. For example, the Brits spend almost $100 for the BBC per year, and many countries around the world spend so much more than we do. And it really shows both in the health of our public media and in our democracy. And indeed, tons of research shows this positive correlation between having a healthy, robust public media system and a healthy democracy. And I won't leave folks in suspense. The US is no longer a healthy democracy by any measure. So conversely, it's also true that weaker democracies have weaker public media systems. And what the research shows is that when you have access to public media, you see higher levels of political knowledge, higher levels of civic engagement, lower levels of extremism. So it's certainly bad for democracy not to have public media. And beyond that, and if we look historically for why we in the States and in most countries around the world established public broadcasting systems in the first place, it's based on this recognition that there are things that a commercial media system will never do. They will never provide adequate levels of news and information to marginalized communities. They'll never provide high quality children's programming, educational fare, cultural content, all these things that a commercial media system just is not incentivized to do. A commercial media system will never try to reach all members of society. Public media not only try to reach everyone, but it's free content. They don't put it behind a paywall. So there are all these reasons and more that we should be funding our public media. And finally, we know that increasingly communities across the country would not have access to any local media whatsoever if it weren't for their local public media outlets. So they would become news deserts. And it's really both local journalism and emergency communications that local communities often rely on for their public media. And it's those public media outlets that are going to lose their funding. They disproportionately rely on federal funding. And without federal funding, many of these stations will go under. And it's not an exaggeration to say this is a matter of life and death for these communities when you think about climate catastrophes and various so-called natural disasters where they really have to rely on their local public media because there's no other local media in existence.
Yeah, thanks, Victor. And I appreciate you really grounding it in the reality that I think a lot of communities are going to be finding themselves in now, where there isn't a local news station they can turn to that they can trust on the reporting, but also just find out like what's happening when there's an emergency, an issue increasingly becoming common with climate change and kind of more extreme weather. Yeah, I appreciate that, Victor. And Representative Rabb, I want to pass it over to you because I think, Victor kind of named this is what we stand to lose, and this is kind of the moment we find ourselves in. You, however, are kind of now like taking action at the state level and thinking about new ways of providing public support so that communities can get trusted local news and information. I would love for you to share a little bit about the proposed legislation that you've kind of announced that you plan on introducing, and what drew you to these approaches, and how do you think they're going to benefit Pennsylvanians both in the short and long term?
Sure. I have to be transparent. This is very self-serving. Let me tell you why. I am a member, I'm one of 253 members of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. Why is that important? Because while remaining nonpartisan, you all know that it is a very critical swing state. So it determines where things go on the national level, Pennsylvania. We are also the largest full-time state legislature. We are also a state where a lobbyist that could represent big media conglomerates or fossil fuel entities can, through their lobbyists, buy me a summer house. And it's legal in the state of Pennsylvania. There are no campaign contribution limits. So anyone who wants to try to buy me or rent me while I'm in public office can do so and cut $100 million check for someone who represents just 4 neighborhoods in Northwest Philly. That is the context in which I labor as a public servant on the state level. So how is it related to the legislation in this issue? I work in a hyper polarized, toxic workplace where state reps, and again, there's 203 of us in the House, have different email suffixes based on our party, which is absurd. So if you're a Democrat and you're a state rep, your suffix is pahouse.net. If you're a Republican, it's pahousegop.com. We can't even agree on like the basics of like electronic infrastructure. So everything is polarized. And the base that really allows incumbents to get reelected is in a state where we have closed primaries. So the way people get reelected is to appeal to the most base characteristics and sentiments of voters that represent a very small percentage of the 70,000 people we all represent. How are they getting their information? How are they determining what's a legislative priority? And how are they influencing the people who will be creating the public policy to benefit 13 million Pennsylvanians? It all comes back to the narratives that infect them or inspire them. And I got to tell you, in 9 years that I've served in the state legislature, I don't know if I've ever had more journalists in the audience than the people on the stage at the press conference. That's nuts. Sometimes we'll have one journalist and like 25 people on the stage. And it is so mind-numbing and disappointing and disillusioning to think that our fourth estate has been gutted and hardworking journalists are being laid off, and that there are people whose voices are not being heard, either formally or informally. And so that's one of the reasons that I was inspired to introduce this legislative package that frankly, Free Press brought to me. And the reason I was so excited is I have a longstanding relationship with you all. Free Press has been there. I probably have a 20-year working relationship when I was working on net neutrality issues, when we were talking about the blogosphere, if anyone remembers that term, or new media before social media was a thing. So this is a great convergence of interests for the good people at Free Press. So when I saw what other states were doing, and I saw the need in Pennsylvania, where there's 17 counties out of 67 that have 1 or fewer newsrooms left. And they're largely in rural districts. I represent a small town in Southeast called Philadelphia, but there are even smaller towns across the state that have no coverage. And those folks need good, solid, substantive, balanced information, community-centered news as well. We all do. And so the bills are essentially creating the consortium that is largely based on what happened in New Jersey to provide grants to build these community newsrooms. And then secondly, another bill to create a fellowship to put more journalists into the pipeline so we build capacity. It's very straightforward, and it should be bipartisan. And when I introduce these bills very soon, we'll see what kind of bipartisan support I get. But to the point of one of the questions in the chat, so many things have been weaponized. So even the most basic facts now are disputed. We're going to be talking about gravity next month, probably. Is gravity real? It's difficult, but there is a way forward. And I have had success in getting bipartisan bills passed. It is not easy, but we have to find a way to cross the transom and reach out and say, this is not a partisan issue. This transcends partisanship. This is how it benefits folks from all ideologies and all geographies. There's a way to do it. It's going to be hard, but the only way it's going to work is through collective action and care and empathy and humility. Because once we say, oh, the folks in rural communities are backwards and they're illiterate, we've already lost. I don't like that type of bigotry. As a Black person, I'm used to fighting the kind of bigotry that is against my community. But we can't then in the same turn talk about othering rural communities as though they're somehow less important or less caring of their communities and their families as anyone else. So this is what I seek to do, Mike. And all the help I can get to get it over the finish line would be greatly appreciated.
I appreciate that, Representative. And, if you look right across the river to New Jersey, that was a bipartisan bill to help create the consortium. We know that local news is not a partisan issue, even as much as it might be sometimes at the national level. At the local level, people just want to get news and information about where they live, kind of regardless of their political stripes. And I think lawmakers on both sides of the aisle really do understand that. So I appreciate you sharing that, Representative.
Hey, Mike, I'm sorry. This is such a rare opportunity to talk about media policy. 9 years in office, I can't remember the last time this happened. So can I just say one other thing?
Yeah, go ahead, Representative.
Okay, I'll be brief. Sorry to my other panelists. One of the benefits of empowering and strengthening and building the capacity in rural communities that are nowhere near my very urban district in Philadelphia is that it allows opportunities to engage in good faith with people who have different perspectives and lived experiences and ideologies, which requires me to better appreciate where other people are coming from to make my points more salient to people who don't already agree with me. I represent the bluest bubble in the entire Commonwealth. So I don't have to convince many of my neighbors and constituents on pretty much any issue, but I'm a state lawmaker. So I have to be able to make my case in districts and communities that don't share my priorities or perspectives. If the better I understand their stories and their narratives as lifted up by community-based media outlets and journalism, the better it will help me be a public servant, communicate and fully understand why they think the way they do, so I can potentially kind of meet them where they are and perhaps change things. And the reason I say that is not because I'm an optimist, because I'm actually aggressively allergic to optimism. I say that out of personal experience. I've gone to these communities and I've been able to reach them where they are without being condescending or pandering and say, I appreciate perspective. Can we look at it from another perspective and find some common ground? I've done that even on reparations. I've done that on fracking. I've done that on prison reform. Who's covering these issues matters. If they're not being covered, they're watching the usual suspects and following things that are not with journalistic integrity, and you can't reach them. But if it's community-centered and it's journalists who are generating this, there's a fighting chance. And I just really wanted to lift that up because a lot of my colleagues don't feel comfortable leaving their comfort zone. And it's the best way I've grown as a legislator.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. And, couldn't agree with you more. This is, we know that local news is a way that doesn't just give us information about like what's happening in government. It also helps us feel like a connectiveness to the people around us and the communities that we live in. Abigail, I wanted to pass it to you because I think you've got an interesting perspective on this. Like you mentioned, the 51st kind of grew out of cuts at a public radio station. Now you're doing it as like a nonprofit, as a worker collective. There's also challenges when it comes to raising money in that space too. Um, I would love for you to share a little bit about, I guess, like, you know, share a little bit about like the work you do in terms of like, the service you provide for your community, but also, what are the challenges you're facing when it comes to actually helping to resource that work, and why public funding is an important, why you think that public funding is an important part to the solution.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a really important starting point for our work is that we're in Washington, D.C., and despite being a major metropolitan area, despite being the nation's capital, D.C. has not been insulated from the national decimation of local news. The Washington Post is not only now owned by Jeff Bezos, they have really almost fully abdicated their local coverage. As I said, WAMU laid off the majority of their journalists last year. We have a handful of really fantastic smaller community publications and newspapers, but they are often staffed by a handful of journalists. I believe Washington, D.C. has lost 46% of its newspapers over maybe the past decade. And again, like the problems that we're facing pale in comparison to what rural jurisdictions are facing. The 51st attempt to be a part of solving that problem is to start a worker-run news outlet. I think we're part of a really exciting movement in journalism right now, which is journalists saying, actually, oligarchs owning newspapers is a really scary thing for our democracy, and it makes for bad journalism. So how can we create outlets that where the people who are doing the journalism are also determining the future of the publication, or are determining coverage areas, are determining how the organization is run, or determining the governance structures. And I think with that, really ensuring that we are creating media organizations that are directly responsive to and in communication with the communities that we're covering. And we believe that being a worker-run outlet really allows us to do that better. I think as we are thinking about how to rebuild journalism and how incredibly vital journalism is for democracy, it's really important for us to also not glorify journalism. Journalism has a long history of fanning racist crime panics, of paving the way for the American war machine, of negatively covering low-income populations, et cetera. So we're really trying to not just rebuild journalism, but rebuild something, but build something new that's a lot better. I think it's helpful to look at how successful our fundraising has been at the 51st and how far we still have to go when we're talking about how absolutely vital public funding is for media. Before we even launched last year, the 51st ran the most successful crowdfunding campaign in worker-owned news history. We raised over $276,000 from over 3,400 contributors before we had published a single article. For comparison, Block Club Chicago, which is a fantastic worker-run outlet in Chicago, raised $183,000 in 2018. And at the time, that was the most a local news organization had ever raised on Kickstarter. We've been publishing for just under a year, and we have over 3,000 members who pay for our journalism. That's about a third of our overall membership. Several months ago, before we were even a year old, we reached the point where the money that we were getting from membership fully covered our labor cost as an organization. And we don't have a paywall. We believe that journalism is a public good and knowledge is a human right. So we rely on people who can pay deciding to do so because they believe in what we're doing. And it's working pretty remarkably, considering all of the challenges. We just ran another crowdfunding campaign last month, and we raised another $125,000, which was matched by a major donor, which allowed us to hire our first 2 full-time employees. Now, I'm so proud of what our team has done, and I think it's really remarkable, but we've also had a lot of advantages. We launched very shortly after a beloved local outlet folded. We were able to sort of like run off of the momentum of like the audience that had already been created there. We operate in a city with a lot of wealth. We operate in a major city that has a lot of people and a decent number of people with money. It's also Washington, D.C., where people are disproportionately civically engaged and whose lives and jobs are directly impacted by local politics and the news, particularly right now when there are literally men with rifles walking around on the sidewalks in my neighborhood. And there's a remarkable dearth of local news for a major metropolitan area. And if I'm being honest, every time Jeff Bezos does something stupid, we see a spike in our membership. And even with all of that, we still have like so far to go in terms of how much we need to fundraise. We literally have like millions of dollar gaps in having the money that we need to become the newsroom that we want to be and the newsroom that Washington, D.C. deserves. The majority of us co-founders are still working as part-time freelancers to stand the organization up. We're a newsroom of 7 people who are not only trying to cover an entire major city, but also edit that coverage, fundraise, engage with our audience, apply for grants, hold events, build governance structures, and just like all of the other tasks that it takes to stand up and operate a newsroom. So I think the kind of legislation the Representative Rabb is talking about, and we have potential legislation in Washington, D.C. By Congress or Council Member Janice Lewis George called the Local News Funding Act, which would essentially let residents decide which local outlets get public grants. That legislation would allocate just 0.1% of the district's general fund budget, which would open up $11.6 million for local news. So I think while membership and paid membership and fundraising and like, you know, communities directly chipping in to make worker run and community-led news work is vital. It means we're directly responsible to our audiences rather than wealthy donors. It allows us to ideate with our communities what journalism can look like and how a local outlet should be structured. And I think those things are critical to building a vibrant local news ecosystem. But we just are still fighting over a relatively small pie of money. And $5, $10, $20 monthly donations does not an entire newsroom build. So I'm really excited that we're talking about public legislation, and I think as excited as we all are about worker-run and community-driven news, we really need to continue talking about the responsibility of politicians and legislators to help us do this work.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Abigail. I appreciate that. And I think you did a good job of kind of drawing that connection to both like the promise and the challenges of new models for journalism and the way that public policy can be used to help support and grow these much more community-rooted public interest news outlets. We've got about 8 minutes left. Unfortunately, because we got started, I do still want to respect people's time and end everything, you know, 2 o'clock Eastern. But I do want to go around and just kind of get a perspective from folks before we wrap up. Victor, I'll start with you. You know, state lawmakers are increasingly take up legislation to support local news. You just heard, you know, Representative and Abigail kind of mentioned a few different policies. You know, from your perspective, how do we ensure that public dollars for local news truly serve the public interest, and what models can we create and lean on to ensure that public funding invests in a sustainable future for local journalism?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think that's absolutely key that we make sure we're not just propping up and restoring the status quo and failing commercial models, but that we're actually transforming our media system from the ground up. And just to build on what Abigail and Representative Rabb was saying, I mean, it's so key, it's so important to have communities involved at every level of resource allocation, news production, and dissemination. There needs to be constant ascertainment where news workers are going into communities and finding out what they want to see covered in their media and back and forth. So we really need to build in participatory democracy at each stage. It's not enough to just fund some outlets and let them be, but we have to make sure there's constant transparency and public accountability, democratic audits, and so forth. But we really need to be thinking even more radically. We should think of this period now as a period of radical experimentation. It's precisely during dark political moments when we should articulate bold policy visions, things that won't happen tomorrow, but need to be on our political horizon. And so when we're talking about building up public media, obviously we're not just talking about NPR and PBS. We're talking about all these various forums. We want to make sure there's a 51st in every community across the country. So, there are radical ideas that we can get into at maybe some other discussion, whether we're talking about public media centers in every community that's federally guaranteed, but locally owned and controlled. Or the late great Bob McChesney had a great idea around the local journalism initiative, where people are voting on how particular money should be allocated to a nonprofit institution of their choice. I think Abigail was just talking about what's going on in DC right now. Seattle, the other Washington, Seattle, Washington, also has a similar media vouchers plan that's being discussed. So radical ideas are already being experimented with, and we just need to see much, much more of that.
Great. Thanks, Victor. Representative, I'm going to go back to you. One is, I think we had some questions in the chat about just some wanting some more clarity on like the two pieces of legislation that you're going to be introducing. And the last thing too, I would ask you in addition, once you share a little bit about that, you're taking this effort and initiative up. What's your call to action to other state lawmakers, either in Pennsylvania or other states who might be looking at similar measures?
So I tried to answer as many of the questions as I could, providing links to the forthcoming legislation. The legislation has been formally introduced yet, but generally speaking, when you have a massive legislature like mine, they're not paying attention to anything until they know that it's actually going to be voted on in committee. But I can say that early interest in these forthcoming bills is pretty good, because I think those of us who distinguish ourselves as public servants versus politicians understand that this is an ecosystem that needs to be grown and fed and respected, because that helps with civic literacy, which dissolves, certainly makes it harder for divisive things to take root. So that's very important. With regard to the specifics of the bills, one of the concerns, and I know Free Press has brought this up too, is making sure that whatever entity provides grants to local media outlets and journalistic outlets, that it is free of politics to the extent possible, right? That is not being, these grants are not awards to people's political friends. That is the norm. So there should be great skepticism around how this is implemented. The devil's in the details. So because I believe in transparency and accountability and public integrity, it's really important to me that when this bill is introduced, that we are very aware of all the gamesmanship that politicians play that make it harder for public servants to do our job on behalf of the communities we serve. So making sure that there is autonomy for an entity that decides where grants go, and making sure that is not rewarding folks unduly and unethically is very important. The other piece is really creating a fellowship for journalists to bring them in on the local level, because the pipeline is not big enough and it's not full enough. So we need to make sure that happens. And I'm also really, really invested in making sure that the diversity of folks in that pipeline is representative across a number of sites of social identity, whether it's geography, gender, ethnicity, class of origin, et cetera, et cetera. That's important too. It doesn't matter how progressive or innovative the apparatus is if the humans in it are homogenous. We can't have that. So all of those things matter, and there's opportunity to weigh in. You said, what is the call to action? After my bills are introduced this month, they will be referred to a specific committee. When we know what committee it is, folks can reach out to the Democratic chair of that committee, because all Democrats are in charge in the Democratic controlled House, and say, please, please run this bill. You can also look at the bill and say, hey, is there a way, we have ideas to make it even stronger if we don't have your feedback before it's introduced so that we can amend it. Ideally, you all do that through Free Press because they're my chief partner in this. But send your feedback to them so that there's going to be a couple of bites of the apple to get it to where it needs to be. So those are my specific calls to action. And if that's something you all can facilitate at Free Press, that'd be wonderful in terms of sharing who people can reach out to specifically. That would be wonderful.
Well, I appreciate the kind word, Representative, and I think, in all of these efforts, no matter, say, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, California, Washington, DC, to Victor's point, one of the most important things here is stakeholder engagement and folks who have a stake in this getting involved. So I appreciate you raising that up and sharing what people can do. Abigail, I'm going to give you the last minute. Kind of on that point of people taking action, you mentioned you're with the Nationals Writer Union. You've gotten involved in different organizing efforts. As someone who's a journalist, but also, does advocacy work, advocating for journalists. What do you think, what have those experiences taught you about the importance of getting organized and why this is maybe an important moment for journalists to get organized to help support independent journalism?
Yeah. Being a journalist right now is really depressing. I think most of us have experienced being laid off. Many of us have experienced 3, 4, 5 layoffs. If you've been lucky enough to hold on to your job, you have watched countless friends and colleagues lose their jobs. Many people are pushed into freelancing, where if they are lucky, you're paid a few $100s to do reporting that often takes weeks, months, even years. Many people have been pushed out of the industry. We lose just countless numbers of journalists every day. And most journalists do this work because they really believe in it. So I think there's a real moral injury that is involved in being a journalist today. Right now, we're all getting countless offers to get paid $20 an hour to train artificial intelligence, large language models to replace our jobs. And I think it can be really easy to lose hope and throw up our hands and give up. And I really want us all to keep centering what you said at the beginning, Mike, and that Victor and Representative Rabb have also spoken to, which is that crisis is also an opportunity. And we have, as media workers, as people who work in media policy, as people who care about journalism, I really believe that we have an outsized opportunity and an outsized responsibility to create solutions to the massive information crisis that we're facing today, which is playing a massively outsized role in all of the other crises that we are facing today. I think the National Writers Union, you don't need to be a staff journalist. You don't need to be part of a union shop to organize with us. I think with the all-out attacks on the National Labor Relations Board and unions and organizing, we really need to figure out how to organize outside of traditional union structures. And I think Free Press is doing some of that work. There are a lot of other advocacy organizations who are doing that work. And as I said earlier, I just really think that it is our main job as journalists can't just be storytelling anymore. A primary job of journalists has to be ensuring that there is journalism for the generations that follow us. So participating in this work is a really important antidote to how depressing this industry is right now and how depressing this world is right now. So yeah, I'd really encourage us all to join together to fight for a better one.
Thanks, Abigail. I appreciate that. And I think, we'll kind of, we'll end on that note, this idea that While we are facing a lot right now, journalism, the communities we live in, our country, one of the ways out of this, or really the only way out of this, is getting organizing, getting active in your community, in local journalism, attending webinars like this and other things, showing up in spaces and showing up in communities. So I appreciate all the folks who stuck with us with the delayed start and a little running over a little bit. I want to thank Representative Rabb, Abigail, Victor, thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your Wednesday. And if anyone ever needs anything, just head over to freepress.net. You can find out more how to get involved. And yeah, thanks again, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
See you, folks.